Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to Enterprise Architecture video series part 3. In the last video, we looked at the 6-layer framework I introduced for establishing an effective enterprise architecture practice in the organizations. So we looked at briefly at each of the layers in the last video. Now we'll start looking at in each layer in detail, right? So we'll dedicate one video for each of the layers, right? So when I say each layer, what we are going to look at is what are the different decisions we need to make at each layer, how each layer is helping us to make the decisions to establish an effective enterprise architecture practice, right? So we'll start with from the top. So when we start from the top, each of these top layers, when we make the decisions, it basically derives some requirements for the lower layers, right? That's why I thought we'll start from the top, right? So today we'll look at the usage layer, and from the next videos we go one by one to the bottom layers, right? Okay, so to start with, let's look at the usage layer. Okay, so here, what are the decisions we need to make, right, on the usage layer? So usage layer is basically about how are we planning to use the enterprise architecture, right? So the first step towards it is to defining who, right? Who are the consumers or the contributors? So people who are going to contribute to enterprise architecture, or people who are going to consume the enterprise architecture in forms of artifacts, right? Or reports or whatever it could be, right? So the stakeholders. So first we have to define who are the consumers and contributors, who are the stakeholders. And then we have to decide on why they are consuming, right? Why each of these stakeholders are going to come to enterprise architecture, right? So it could be bigger for making some strategic decisions. When I say strategic decisions, it's basically could be setting up the vision or setting up the architecture principles or laying out a roadmap for the organization, for the architecture or the organization, etc. Right. And the second aspect, why somebody wants to use enterprise architecture is to establish an architecture governance practice or an organizational governance practice as well, right? Or it could be for the day-to-day or the change management or the project managing the projects, right? And the changes coming our way, right? It could be basically to create the designs for the projects that are coming in our way, right? And finally, the default usage of the enterprise architecture for reference or knowledge purpose. So we basically need to define why each of the stakeholders are using the enterprise architecture, right? And then we have to come to the aspect of what, right? What are they consuming? So when define the why, we need to define what are the components they're going to consume from the enterprise architecture, right? What interests them, basically, right? And then what domains do they belong to, right? So when I say domains, it is as we saw in the domain layer, the TOGAF 4 domains that TOGAF defines, right? And the breadth and depth of the components, right? So what are the stakeholders' primary concerns? Are they at an enterprise level or a lower level? So those are the what aspects of it we need to capture, and how are they consuming it? So basically, how do they intend to consume it, right? What is their viewpoint, right? So that defines what kind of views we need to provide, right? So it's based on the viewpoint requirements. So these are the 4 aspects we want to capture in the next couple of small exercises that we need to do, right, to make these decisions. So let's look at, to start with, we have to do the who, right? So we have to identify the stakeholders. So this is a straightforward exercise, right? So we just need to define who are the contributors. It could be enterprise architects by default, right? The leadership. So when I say leadership, it could be IT leadership or a business leadership to establish the vision or define the architecture principles, right? The higher level guiding principles, etc. Business architects, some organizations have separate role called business architects, so they also would be part of it. Developers who could be contributing towards the lower level artifacts. And then consumers. So it could be anybody in the organization. So we need to define, enterprise architects, developers would become default consumers of it. So it could be leadership, business architects, project managers, product owners, production support teams, right? Quality assurance teams. So whoever it could be, right? So this is the first exercise we want to do is to define who are the stakeholders of the enterprise architecture, right? And then we'll get into the why and what analysis, right? So let's get into that. So once we have the stakeholders, we just need to do a small exercise of mapping of each stakeholders, maybe through talking to the stakeholders, getting a survey done, or whatever way it is, we're going to gather the information on what are the and what are they going to use it, what are the components they're going to use from enterprise architecture and why, right? So the why aspect, to start with the why aspects of when we look at CIO or an IT leadership team as such, right? They may primary use could be the strategic decisions to make strategic decisions. So when we say strategic decisions, right? The purpose, if the purpose being strategic decisions, the typical components they would be used would be the vision, right? The vision of the organization, right? The guiding principles or a roadmap, right? So those are the strategic aspects of it. Or they could be using it for reference perspective at a very high level. So they might need to know the application landscape, the technology landscape, what are the technologies in place in the organization, right? And these aspects, when we define the why and the what, right? We need to just define on what breadth and the depth the stakeholder would be looking at the information at, right? So on a CIO or IT leadership level, it would be at the entire enterprise level, right? But if you look at another stakeholder, right, the sales SME, right? So they could be looking at the project design as their why part of it, because when they come up with a lot of the process changes, they come in, right, as projects. So for them, how do we derive the designs for those projects could be a primary reason why they're going to come to enterprise architecture, right? So, or they could be looking at a process governance perspective. So process flows could be a primary component they may be looking at. And being a sales SME, they may be just are interested only on the sales segment of it, right? So that's where the depth or the breadth aspect coming in, right? So they are looking at a single segment, right? And then if you look at a developer stakeholder, their primary purpose would be the project design. So when a project comes to them, how do they come up with a design, or let's say what changes needs to be implemented for that project, right? So they may be looking at application models, data flows, or a deployment model, whatever it could be, right? That helps them to make those decisions, right? So that's at a typical capability level, right? When we look at an application, it's always at a certain it could be a business capability or an IT capability, right? So they are looking at a capability level, right? So that defines the depth at which they are looking at, right? And the next one of other stakeholder could be the governance team. So architecture, if there is an architecture governance body, so their primary reason coming to the enterprise architecture could be the governance. So they would be looking at guiding principles, the roadmap, the blueprints, right? And they're probably looking, it depends on how the organization structure they would be looking at an enterprise level, right? These are a few examples of how we can lay out the why and what aspect of it, right? And then once we define this, right? So this basically gave us an inventory of who are the stakeholders, right? Why are they coming to the enterprise architecture, and what are the components they want to consume, and also what level they want to consume, right? So this gives a very high level map of that, right? And then we need to do one more little exercise is basically capturing the viewpoints, right? The stakeholders and the viewpoints, right? So for each stakeholder, the way they want to gather the information or use the enterprise architecture could be different, right? So if I am a CEO, so I may want to know so I've just laid out few ways each of these stakeholders could be looking at. So this primarily should be an exercise where we go and gather this information from the respective stakeholder itself, right? So if I am a CIO, basically I want to know the new IT capabilities that are being planned for the year, right? So that could be more of a roadmap aspect, right? Yeah, it could be I want to understand the high level system flow for a sales transaction or any other transaction, or I want to categorize applications based on the business processes they are involved with, right? So this basically gives me a perspective on how a IT leadership or a CIO is looking to use enterprise architecture. This gives me the viewpoints, right? Helps me to design how I want to provide the artifacts or what components I want to use to provide these viewpoints. If you look at an architecture governance stakeholder perspective, they may be looking at what are the technologies or maybe specifically obsolete technologies that are still in the organization and the applications using them, right? So that helps them in doing a compliance analysis, right? Or I want to understand as a architecture governance person, the information model that is being used and the business entities mapped to the respective applications, right? So that gives them to define, are we following a particular pattern, or are there duplication across the organization, etc., right? And if I am a project manager, I want to basically define, identify whether the requirements of the projects, how they map to, can be addressed with the capabilities. So I probably am looking for a list of capabilities that I can look at, saying that these are the requirements coming in and what capabilities are they mapped to, right? Or I want to identify the apps who are consuming an API, right? So if an API change is coming, who are the core consuming applications who will be impacted with that, right? So, or I want to identify the list of applications that's impacted by a business process, right? So, and if I am a business architect, similarly, I'm looking at what are the different functions involved in a particular process. So I want to understand the different customers' touch points across the transactions, right? So more of a journey perspective, right? So all these are different viewpoints that would come from each of the stakeholders. So if you lay them out, it gives us a picture on what are the different ways, or how are people going to use enterprise architecture, which helps us into defining what all views we need to provide, right? How we want to provide, and what are the components needed for that, right? So once we do these two exercises, pretty much we would be able to come up with few inferences, right? Basically, this makes some decisions and few inferences or requirements for the lower levels, right? So basically, we looked at what are the different segments that need to be incorporated, right? So based on stakeholders from different segments, we will be able to identify what are the different segments, what level of detail or depth we want to capture, right? Basically, if I'm looking at supporting developers and manage their project designs through using enterprise architecture, then I'm looking at a specific capability level, right? What are the different domains we need to use, right? So is a business architecture or business team going to use enterprise architecture? Then we definitely need to use the business domain, right? So those are, then if there is are developers going to use it, then do we really need to do the technology domain, right? So all those decisions would come in, right, based on how we're going to use the enterprise architecture. And what are the different views? We looked at how to capture the viewpoints, right? And then finally, we said we can define the who owns based on what domain, right? So who are the stakeholders who are going to contribute towards each of this domain? What are the viewpoints supported? What segmentation are we looking at a level of details, etc. Right? So on a contribution perspective, we'll be able to define, saying that who's going to own that, right? And with this difference inferences, we would be able to make some decisions and then some set of requirements for the lower levels, right? We'll see how these requirements help us in the lower levels, right? And to move on, I wanted to give a quick view on what are the components of enterprise architecture against each of these purpose of the enterprise architecture. So whether we are going to look at a strategic purpose or a reference or a project design or a management perspective or a governance perspective. So these are the typical components of the enterprise architecture, right? So when I'm looking at strategic use, it could be a vision statement, architecture principles, blueprints, right, roadmaps, etc. Right. If I'm looking at reference purpose, typically catalogs, matrices across like process to entity mapping, matrix, or application to business function mapping. So a number of matrices, right, or flows, right, data flows, the system flows, right, process flows, right, or models. It could be the entity model or an application model, right. All these are pretty much part of the reference aspect of it, right? And when I'm looking at deriving project designs or manage change using enterprise architecture, the views and the viewpoints different views comes into picture, right? The plans, it could be project plans, roadmaps, etc. The logs and traceability aspects comes in, the work packages or releases, right? So how do we package different work items together and release, etc. comes in. Governance aspect, when we look at governance aspects, technology standards, architecture patterns and styles, design patterns, solution patterns, etc. And then compliance reports, etc. are the typical components that comes in for governance, right? So I just wanted to give a quick view of this. And before we close out, we want to look at the behavioral aspect. So we looked at what are the components and who are going to own it and what level it is, what are the viewpoints we are looking at, right, etc. Now we'll quickly define the behavioral requirements that comes out of this layer, right? So when I say strategic use, right, so typically it needs okay. So let's come this way, right? So I listed a few behavioral aspects of roles, right? So typically when you define stakeholders, we need to define the roles, right? Who is a contributor, who is going to consume, is it a strategic user? So the roles come into picture, right? When on a discoverability perspective, when I'm looking at using enterprise architecture more of a reference or knowledge, the discoverability comes into picture. How I'm going to discover it? How can I, maybe I want to discover by the function or application, whatever way you want to search, right? Or when I look at the project management perspective, also discoverability comes into picture. Integration aspect comes in when I'm primarily looking at project designs or project management, how do I integrate with the project management tools, right? So maybe if I'm using Jira, right, how do I integrate my EA tool with Jira, right? So that I can directly take my enterprise architecture artifacts, integrate into bring it over to the project management tools, right? When I'm looking at governance aspects, so compliance checks comes in. So I need to have a proper compliance checks or reporting capability, and the workflow becomes an important aspect, right? So how do I take it through the approval process or whatever way we want to manage the governance process, right? So all those. So these are some of the behavioral requirements that comes in. So these behavioral requirements should be implemented up in the lower levels, right? So we need not limit ourselves to these behavioral requirements. This is just for an example, but we need to go through this exercise of identifying what are the behavioral requirements that we want to support on as part of the enterprise architecture practice. Right? With that, we kind of looked at in a little bit detail on what all different aspects we need to look at on a usage layer perspective and what are the decisions that we need to make on this layer to help us establish the enterprise architecture practices, right? Quickly, we define the stakeholders, we define why they are coming to the enterprise architecture, right? And what are they going to look for in the enterprise architecture, right? And define how the stakeholders will be using it or viewing the information, right? So we define the viewpoints. We quickly looked at what are the typical components of enterprise architecture by their Y aspect, right? And then we also looked at some of the behavioral requirements, right? So next video, we'll look at the next lower level, the evolution aspect, right? Thanks very much for your time. Thank you.